management tools. It's really built to make cybersecurity easier. Welcome back to another episode of MSP Cyber Roundtable. We're doing something a little special today, as you can see with the colors that are actually, it's sort of fun. And your purple color works great with Fort Mesa Green, I'm noticing, Brad. But in any case, I've got guests from the insurance industry here today. I've got Brad Fraser from InfoProtect UK, who heads up cyber assessments in our partner network with high-risk clients in the mid-market, in the UK, South Africa. And I've got Freddy Knight, who's had a storied career in the trenches of underwriting, really. Cyber underwriting and brokerage. So, what we're talking about today is going to be high-risk clients, difficult to insure clients, which if you're a service provider or you work for or you work in an enterprise if you've got an IT department, you got more than a couple of people, right? Or you got a couple of people, but you got a lot of footprint, right? You're probably difficult to insure. So our conversation today is going to be very relevant. Before we get into topic of the day, I want to just, Brad's been, Brad, have you been on the roundtable before? I don't actually recall.
No, this is my first time.
Oh, your first time on the roundtable. Okay, so there's a roundtable requirement about telling a little bit of your backstory, at least the first time you're on here. So I'm gonna hit you up for a story, Brad, but since Freddy's not surprised, I'm gonna hit him up first. And so here's the rules of the storytelling. We have many people watching in the IT industry that wonder how do you get to your place in career where you're an expert in industry, particularly the people in the IT sector that are looking at, hey, in 15 years, if I want to be expert in cyber, right? What are the choices that I need to be making now? That's actually a question we get a lot. So I just love to tell the stories, and it's sometimes interesting where they go. So, Freddy, I'm gonna ask you the same question I ask everyone, and I know you've spent your time not in a necessarily an engineering role, right? But you've definitely been at the edges of cyber. How did you get into, I guess in this case, cyber insurance, right? But tell me what led up to that in your career, because I don't think you started there, right? Cyber insurance didn't exist as something you could buy right at the beginning of your career.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was, I think if you ask this question to most people in the insurance industry, they'll say they fell into insurance. And it's probably the same for me in one way or another, right? Nobody grows up thinking, I cannot wait till I turn 18 to become an insurance broker, but it kind of happens, right? My exposure to cyber happened relatively early on in my career, to be truthful. It was, I was a relatively junior member of staff working at a brokerage. And we were looking after a portfolio of printing clients. So they printed marketing materials and educational materials for a broad range of type of clients. And one of those businesses suffered a loss. So I wasn't the owner of the account, if you will, but I was working on the account with the owner of the account. And one of those businesses, those printers, suffered a malware loss. So somebody opened some ransomware in the organization. There was no segregation between their admin system.
Wait, slow down, because this story is great, but let's place this in time. Not to, I don't normally ask people how old they are, but in this case, it's relevant because the industry's changed a lot. So what year was this? This was
probably touching 15 years ago, perhaps 13 years ago from now. So where are we? 2025. We're probably looking at around 2012,
so if
2013,
I
around that
recall
time.
at that point in time, theoretically, if you read the IT news, you'd heard of crypto malware, but most people hadn't seen it firsthand at that time. It was this theoretical thing that existed, right?
Yep,
And
absolutely. It's a bit like what quantum
yeah,
computing is now, right? So there's waves of it
theoretical.
going around, but no quite understands the
So
risk
it got real
presented,
for you.
or it got real
Yeah.
real quick.
Okay.
But this was mine, all right. As a junior member of staff, it would be expected that most of the stuff I saw would have been my first exposure to these type of risks. But actually, there were members of the team that had been doing it for 20 or 30 years, and this was
Yeah.
also their first real exposure into cyber threats, if you will. So it kind of gives you an idea of how early in the cyber insurance journey this was. But one of those printing businesses suffered a malware loss, right? So there was no segregation between their admin systems and their manufacturing or printing systems. So the malicious software made its way to the printing systems, and it messed up a couple of print runs for them. Now that sounds pretty insignificant, but those couple of print runs happened to be for their two largest clients, which made up about 40% of their revenue, and they lost those clients off the back of that. And within 6 weeks of the event happening, that business folded.
That was
It went out of
fast.
business real fast, real fast. So I mean, look, anybody who's been in business knows that if one event can turn your business kaput, if you will, within 6 weeks, perhaps there were more issues at play, but nonetheless, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And it was there was no coverage in place at that time. There was coverage available in the market, but it was very young, it was very raw, and there were not as many examples or real world case studies that you could use to explain this risk to policyholders in the way they would get it. But that was my first exposure to cyber risk, right? It was a cyber event that caused a multi-million-pound business to go bust within a matter of weeks. So for me, it was almost like, well, actually, there's something in this, right? Whether it's now, whether it's 5 years or 10 years from now, it's something that perhaps I should begin to understand. And that led me on the path that got me to where I am today. So from there, I spent the next 6 or 7 years as a general insurance broker, but always remained focused on the cyber side of things. Worked my way up to head of cyber or cyber practice specialist within a fantastic brokerage called Stackhouse Poland in the UK. And when they sold that business to a much larger brokerage, I teamed up with some friends from the market, and we built what became known as OSR, or Optimum Specialty Risks, which was a cyber insurance MGA. So I kind of hopped from one side of the fence to the other. Spent a few years as an insurance broker, understanding what clients want to hear, the type of language that you need to use to really find the pressure points from a cyber perspective in their business and operations. And then on the other side of the fence, I understood what an insurer, an underwriter, and a reinsurer really wanted to look at to manage risk, underwrite risk, and help provide those policies and coverage to the brokers that can hopefully stop events like the one I experienced happening again.
You didn't exactly get struck by lightning, but you were standing on the sidewalk when someone else got struck by lightning, standing right next to you.
That's a really morbid analogy, but you're absolutely spot on.
Well, I mean, it's a big. I think I asked this. It's part of our process when we support partners to always have a conversation with their end clients about how are you insured, right? Which is sometimes a difficult conversation because a lot of clients don't know how they're insured. They're like, "Oh yeah, we own insurance. You have a cyber policy? Yeah, we got a cyber policy." And it's like $50,000 in their general liability bundle, right? And it just this type of situation. Well, okay, like you could fix. Maybe you can fix the machine. Maybe you can't. I mean, those printer machines can get expensive. But the issue here, right, was the loss of confidence, right? Which
Yeah, loss of confidence in their ability to deliver what they were being
which
paid
is
to deliver.
a very particular type of risk, right? And you do have to think about you do have to ask those what ifs when you go and try to insure to protect yourself, right? And then you have to find out if you're protected against those types of what ifs. And in this case, I guess there wasn't perfect protection, and frankly, it still happens this year, right? Businesses go out of business really quickly sometimes, particularly manufacturing businesses. Are particularly sad horror stories for us in the IT sector and cyber, because it can happen so quickly. The business can go under so quickly.
A really interesting point that perhaps is worth touching on. You mentioned just briefly there the relationship between yourselves as a like an IT vendor and asking the questions around
Yeah,
insurance, and quite often how they'll say, "Oh, we're not insured," or perhaps we are, but it's not quite how we want it to be. Look, that conversation in its own right has evolved in those 12 or 13 years massively itself. Right. So back then, the IT vendors or the MSPs, whatever it may be, were kind of at loggerheads with the insurance market initially, because there was almost a sense that well, if you need to insure these risks, then I, as the IT manager, I'm not doing my job right. Right, I should be your first line of defence, not this insurance policy. But as we saw more of these losses and more of these risks, and actually as cyber policies evolved themselves with risk management and third-party partnerships with IT vendors, that sort of started to dissipate. The relationship started to grow where you'd find vendors asking about insurance and suggesting in some cases that insurance be in place before they work together.
yeah. Well, um, I don't know. I'm not usually in position to coach people about a career in insurance brokerage. But if you were to share any words of wisdom here, that moment of inspiration where you decided, I want to go be part of the solution, what would you tell yourself? I guess 14 years ago at this point. So
So
if,
run that
if
one
you were
past me
going to
again,
talk
Matt,
to
if you
yourself
can.
14 years ago, at that moment where you were like, I'm going to go be part of the solution, right? What would you tell yourself?
Firstly, don't do it, right? But seriously, if I was, I would work very early on understanding the language, or making sure that the underwriters and the insurance market speak the same language as the economy that they're working within, right? So for many years, and this has only recently changed, but for many years, clients and policyholders were speaking one language and insurers were speaking another, right? There was relative disparity between the two. We were asking about security measures and stuff like that, when clients actually wanted to know, look, if I don't know the ins and outs of this technology, right? I'm a printer, I'm a manufacturer, I'm a lawyer. I don't know the specifics of ransomware, malware. I want to know that if the proverbial hits the fan, can my business still operate? Right? Can I still pay my staff? Can I still file my returns or draw my invoices, whatever it may be? And it took us the best part of a decade to come to where we are now, where actually those two languages are starting to align. And the insurers, the underwriters, and our market is starting to understand the best way to speak about these risks to clients in a way that they're happy to
Yeah, it's the
digest.
reason why I arrived where I am in industry, and Brad's in a similar situation where we're using the language of compliance. Um, and it doesn't really matter which compliance book you open, because the language is very similar. But the insurance industry is sort of orbiting around ISO 27K, right? So when you
Yep.
use that language to talk to an owner about their investments in technology, right, you're speaking the same language that the underwriter is speaking when they're asking about, have you implemented X, Y, and Z to lower your risk. And that's super super helpful. And
Correct.
you're right that language, it may have theoretically existed 15 years ago, but it wasn't a common language 15 years ago.
Yep.
Um, so
No, agree.
Brad, I'm not sure which question to ask you, because I've heard some of these stories before, but I think you could tell the adventure version of your life, of how you landed in what led up to the moment that InfoProtect found itself at the center of cyber, right? Um, there were stops along the way for you, right? And then stops along the way for InfoProtect. We'll talk about the cyber part in a moment. Let's talk about the story part. Where did you come from?
Yes, I need to be quick with that one, Matt, because as you know, I could carry on for a while. Um, my story really goes back 30 years when I was in an entrepreneurial space in the motor trade predominantly, and as Freddie heard a little while ago, gas as well. And 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 I decided, so that was in 1994, and I needed a change, and I thought, well, I'll go and work for someone. And that was harder than I thought, because no one wanted to employ me, obviously, because I was this maverick that had just done things their own way. So anyway, I've got a financial background, strangely enough, and I got a job, a real job, as a financial manager at an IT company in South Africa, and that just progressed at a rate, because I got excited about the technology and everything that was going with it. But there was no security involved. I mean, there were firewalls and your basic stuff. And then, so this company progressed, and we got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And we acquired more businesses, and I learned about IT from one end to the other. So whether it was hardware, it was software, it was licensing, it didn't matter. I was fortunate to learn all about this, and international businesses as well. And then about 15 years later, I like rub my eyes, and I'm still working for this business. I need to get back on my own. So I created InfoProtect, because at that stage, now we're talking 2010, so a little bit before Freddy's story, and security, the word cyber still hadn't manifested, but security was starting to be the flavor of the IT
Yep.
industry. Okay. But security from firewall and antivirus. And it was that kind of um, grudge sale, or grudge purchase rather, because in 1995, no one wanted to buy antivirus. And in well, that was the beginning of it. 2010, they still didn't want to buy antivirus. And there were maybe 5 or 6 viruses that even existed. So it wasn't a big thing. But then it started to blossom. And InfoProtect at that stage was an IT service provider or an MSP, whichever definition you want to make of it. But we were traditional. We did the connectivity, we did all the good technology stuff that businesses needed to function. And then when I sold the South African operation to create a UK one, and COVID hit, and Brexit and everything else in the UK, so it was difficult to start an MSP from scratch in the UK without a base and without really understanding the industry as such. And a friend of mine in the insurance industry said, I think there's a gap here where insurance brokers are struggling to match what the insurers are asking for, what the clients think they should be doing, and how do they sell this policy called cyber insurance, and how can everyone benefit from it? So that I started looking at that and creating a program, but the program was still technology based, until Matt, you and I got to know one another, and I thought, hang on, there's a completely different angle that we need to take towards cyber, and that's around governance, risk, and compliance. And once again, whether it's ISO 27K, whether it's NIST, whether it's CIS, it doesn't really matter. You need to have a baseline. You need to have your standard that you can manage everything by. And with that, we started looking into the insurance industry and realized that even though they were talking compliance and certain things, there's still too much, in my view, there's still much of a disparity from the various insurers and what questions they're asking. They're asking, do you have MFA? Yes, no. Do you back your data up? Yes, no. And as we all know, there's a lot more nuances behind that yes/no question that should be looked at, especially from an underwriting point of view and a security point of view at the actual client. And you need to go into those depths. And then more importantly, you need to look at the human aspect of it. So that old story of people, process, technology, what comes first? People, then the process, then the technology. And that's where we've gotten to that space now. And we think it's growing, and really excited about where the industry's taking it, let alone where Infraprotect's taking it.
Yeah, and just to fill in an important aspect of the story that you stepped over, the reason why we're not focused on just firewall and antivirus the way you were doing 10, 20 years ago, when the security industry was just blossoming, is because the risk is now everywhere. It's not outside, right? And the only way of protecting from that risk everywhere is really to get all of the people in the organization behind the things we need to do to protect ourselves. And yeah, a lot of that's going to fall to the IT people, but not all of it, right? And if only the IT people are cheering along security, you're definitely not safe. So you really do need to take a people first approach to who's doing what, when, right?
Yeah.
And do we have security all the way around our castle, right? And that's where those organized frameworks come in. I want to take a moment before we talk about high risk clients to just talk about the normal insurance process. My understanding is, and Freddie, I think you could fill in here as the universal expert of the day here, because you're our expert on the call for this part. My understanding is it doesn't matter where you are on the planet. You could be in New York or Timbuktu. When you buy cyber insurance, there's international markets for that type of risk, and the markets really dictate what types of risks are acceptable at what cost of insurance. And so it's really a universal standard right now, and it's a moving target, my understanding. But this is not while there may be licensure requirements for people selling insurance in different markets, the actual policies themselves are pretty much the same, and so are their underwriting criteria everywhere. Is that true?
To a certain extent, I would say the vast majority of policies are written on that basis. There are certain parts of the world or certain parts of global economies that require a more bespoke approach. Probably not really worth diving into much here, but in the vast majority, yeah, you're right.
From the perspective of people watching today, we're talking about everyone, no matter where you are, unless you're in a strange situation. In addition to that, I understand, and the requirements change depending on those macroeconomic conditions and market conditions, and the threat space changes and technology changes. But there's blanket underwriting authority for many businesses. Do you want to tell the short version? Because I think you can just probably articulate it better than I can, because I barely understand it. How does that normally work if you're in a not high risk situation?
So it's kind of worth touching on the evolution of that space as well, right? Because what it was like 10, 15 years ago is entirely different to what it was like now. And Brad kind of touched on it a moment ago about the yes/no side of things. So when cyber first began to be written, it was a relatively unknown risk. It was probably one of the first, when you think about it, one of the first risks, and again, this speaks to your point, Matt, that was entirely global, right? So fire insurance, property insurance, liability insurance was largely isolated in the territory that policy was written. So you're not going to have your building set on fire in the UK by somebody domiciled in America. Likewise, you're very unlikely to have your premises broken into in America by somebody from North Korea or Russia, for instance. Well, cyber threats kind of change that, because it's a global landscape. So there was absolutely an evolution that happened there, and what we saw was when cyber coverage was first written, being an unknown risk or a lesser known risk, there were a lot of questions that needed to be asked. There was comfort that needed to be sought from the reinsurers and the underwriters that could only be found in really diving into the detail. As the years went by and the claims data began to grow in size and the actuarial inputs could actually monitor risk more better, if you will, than they could initially, we started to see them actually delivering what the clients needed. So what you had initially were insurance brokers that would spend 6 to 8 weeks trying to convince their clients they need to get a cyber insurance quotation, right? They would spend weeks and weeks doing so. And when the client finally said, yeah, okay, look, we'll get a quotation, the only option the insurance broker had was to then go, here's a 20-page proposal form, go away and complete it. Again, which is probably another 6 to 8 weeks work if they even get round to doing it, right? It's taken that long to convince them to do it in the first place. So there was a lot of work done by the reinsurers, the actuarial teams, and the MGAs and underwriters to make that process of buying cyber insurance much easier, which meant taking a gamble would be the wrong word, but taking an educated guess on which questions can we ask, how can we condense this question set and still provide decent risk transfer, but reducing the risk for us as insurers at the same time. A lot of that was done via risk management, especially in the cyberspace. So partnering with third-party providers, or in the case of some MGAs, developing their own proprietary systems to manage this risk, which meant they could ask fewer questions. But again, as the claims data evolved and as the buying process evolved, that question set just reduced. And we got to a position not so long ago, actually, for sort of non-high risk or vanilla clients. You could get a quotation just based on your URL or your website and perhaps one or two other questions.
Right.
But that doesn't serve the higher risk clients as well as it does the smaller risk clients, because what you then have is a situation where if we're comfortable writing 90% of our risk on this condensed underwriting basis, it's just much easier to say to the 10% that don't fit that, actually, we're not comfortable in writing it. We're just not going to write it. Or we are going to write it, but we're going to apply heavy restrictions or massive premiums, massive excess.
So just to sum up there, it used to be that everyone got the long form, and then an underwriter really like dug in and made a decision. And not only did that add friction to the buying process, right? But I presume it added cost on the underwriting side, right? Which raised the, I guess it would raise the bar, right, for getting into an insurance product.
Well, an interesting thing to note, Matt, just quickly, is that actually as that question set reduced over, let's say, a 7-year period up until now, premiums have done likewise. So there was a short spell during COVID where we saw a hard market and we saw premiums rise. Realistically, in the same amount of time, if you chart the graphs, you'll see that premiums have reduced at the same time as the question.
And I've seen that if you're looking for $1 million or $2 million in coverage and you're in a not super risky part of the market, you can now buy cyber insurance similar to the way you can buy auto insurance. And it's in some cases even easier than buying general liability or like a professional E&O. That's been actually exciting for me, because I've seen tons of small businesses that didn't have insurance coverage and were taking the brunt of losses, right, now be able to protect themselves and participate in that risk, that group risk process. So that's been really exciting. But at the same time, I guess the short form version of the calculations, right, they still don't work up in the mid-market and large enterprise where there's a lot of risk on the table. They don't work in some verticals as well, as I understand, or certain types of businesses. So then we're in a different process. I don't think that long form has gotten much shorter, although I think that the process of there's definitely this. You brought up the language, right? People speak the same language now. Getting through the process is easier, but we still need support, and which is sort of the adventure land that you're in right now, Brad, right? At InfoProtect is you're somewhat of a navigator for people who need to go through that custom underwriting process, right? Or it's not always custom underwriting, right? I don't want to misuse terms, Freddy, so help me out here. But the law.
I don't know myself, Matt. I'm just going to smile away.
The non-short form, the longer form version. it's something where we really need help getting through that process, and not just help getting through the process, but help even understanding what our security is before you fill out the form. And if you're not where you should be, how do you get there, right? There's this blank on the form. You know you're not doing a bunch of stuff. Is it optional? Do you have to do it? How do you do it? Is a space where the insurers really don't help you, and you really do need outside advisory. And Brad, I want to take a moment to stick you up on the big screen here. So um, you're our first responder here in this space. What have you seen in the last few years here? Um, have you seen big changes?
Well, I think it's based on what Freddy is saying as well, that the questions are a bit smaller. Um, the limits, the size of the business that you can get insurance for has risen. But there's still caveats, if I can understand, in that space, where the MGAs or the insurers are reserving the right to do their own cyber resilience or cyber security checks on the client if they feel something's not right. So, and that's great. And don't get that process wrong. So I'm not knocking the insurers or the MGAs in that particular space. But what I always feel, and this is how we've been working in the last couple of years with the brokers that we're dealing with, where the brokers we're dealing with have become very proactive, and they've been saying, before we go to market with a particular client's risk, let's get InfoProtect to check the level of that client's risk, and then, almost like a Shark Tank type scenario or Dragon's Den, present the client's credentials, risk credentials, in the correct way to the insurer when they're actually going to be asking for insurance. So fill in the application form. So in a lot of cases, we marrying the two as part of our process. We're taking the short form, we're helping the client complete it, because there are nuances in there. How do you answer it correctly? So yes, it's maybe a tick. Do you have MFA? Yes, there's a tick. But we then back it up with a whole lot of mitigation explanation to enhance the form. What that immediately does, so the form's great. We present the form, and what would that mean? The client would get a vanilla response, and they would get a vanilla policy, and they would get a vanilla premium, vanilla cover. What we then found by taking our process, and we've gone through the whole compliance routine with the client, we then helped the client understand where they are in terms of their cyber risk journey. But we then presented that cyber risk journey to the MGA or the insurer in such a way that it gives them a lot more confidence. And by them getting that confidence, the clients automatically, if they are doing the things that we recommend that they do, get a further reduction in premium, even though it's a soft market, and they get better cover. So it's an enhanced service that goes beyond just, well, we can get this by answering three things.
So by backing up the application process with some evidence, with some objective view, with some documentation, you're able to help people get insurance where they might not be able to, and where maybe they could get a policy, you can bring down that price in a really substantial way. I want to point out one third thing here, and I'm Freddie. Sorry, you're the insurance industry punching bag of the day, but I've heard, not from Freddie, from other people in the industry that I work closely with, that it's the insurer's job to make sure that they're holding up their end of the story, right? And they're going to respond in an incident, which is the biggest thing you're buying when you buy insurance, is that team of cyber paratroopers that arrive on site to save the day, right? You really want that, and it's the easiest way to get that is through an insurer. So the insurer is showing up with their team, but they want to know that everything you filled out on that application that they made a risk decision on, right, to pay for those paratroopers was accurate, right, and is still accurate, right? And I think that there are businesses out there that think that they can just make stuff up on the form, and if they get away with it, they're good. And it's like, well, yeah, you're good if all you want to do is pay money to the insurer and not care if you get taken care of in an incident, because it's not like you'll be able to hide the fact that you didn't X, Y, or Z. And that's another reason why it's really important to have someone there to make sure that your disclosures, right, have backing.
You know what? I think it's deeper than that, Matt. I think in reality we might be doing what Brad and the guys at InfoProtect do a disservice by kind of leaning too heavily into that, because it's not just the client that they're helping in doing this. But the MGAs and the insurers themselves, these guys, right, and girls, they would love nothing more than to be able to, every time they saw a billion revenue cyber risk, they would love to spend 6 weeks in that business, speaking to the compliance teams, speaking to the IT teams, watching how the operations work, watching how the finances move and stuff like that. It's not through a lack of desire to understand that picture that they don't perhaps grasp it every time. It's a resource issue.
They don't have the
right?
time.
Nobody,
they don't have the time to do that.
Time, and you touched on it earlier, Matt, in the expanded underwriting procedure by default increases the premiums because you have to commit more man hours to it, right? So it's not financially viable, or from a time perspective viable, for those guys and girls to do this. However, if somebody like Brad and InfoProtect can do that, where they can show, look, not only do we adhere to this form, but we've done a whole bunch of work with these guys. And actually, I think you would particularly, Mr. Insurer, be interested in knowing that whilst this port is open, it can't be breached because of X, Y, Z, right? So that no on an application then becomes not only a yes, but a yes, and here's why it's not a risk to us as an insurer. So it's a really cool way of, it's one of those rare situations in business where everybody wins, whether you're the client who's getting more attractive terms, whether you're the insurer that's getting a much deeper understanding of the risk. There's an opportunity in these high risk middle market to corporate size clients to help them paint a much better picture.
And it's not just I want to touch on that attractiveness bit. I talk with a lot of CISOs, right? And some people may not be aware, but there's a whole if you call up a brokerage, they're not going to tell you this, right? But if you have a really good story to tell about cyber, you can shop it around. And if you've done a good job at talking about the great work you're doing in security, right, you will be an attractive customer to underwrite to the insurer, right? And so they will they'll compensate you for that, right, with the reduced premiums. And that's it's something that when you have a really great security story to tell, it's there's every insurance agent I've ever talked to says, well, we're just going to help you get the best price, right? And for the most part, it's a lot of talk, because the price is the price. But in the case of cyber, in the case of high risk situations where we're in long form territory, right, it really is true. It really is true that the pricing there is dependent on the situations in the business and the story that's told.
Well, Matt, to some extent, it can be the difference between, never mind price, for some of these high risk clients, it can be the difference between getting cover at all
or not.
Not. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, so it's not just for those guys looking to help insurers understand how they should be priced. Sometimes businesses 2 or 3 years in a row have just been told by the market, look, the risk is too sticky, it's a bit too spiky, we can't quite understand how this part operates, so we're just not going to put terms forward. Actually, if you can go with weeks worth of consultancy information that shows that, I mean, there's a phrase our industry has used for years, which is your employees are your first line of defense. And I hate the phrase, right? An employee is hired by your business to do the job that you've hired them for. If they were all cybersecurity experts, they would be in the cybersecurity industry, right? They're not. They're working for your manufacturing business. I think what that phrase is really meant to say is that the way your employees, the boundaries that your employees are allowed to operate in is your first line of defense. And
Sorry, I got a train here.
Matt, that's awesome.
Yeah, as long as it's not going through your office, you'll be fine.
I think what that really means is compliance, right? So what they're saying is governance, risk, and compliance. It means that your employees will be the ones operating to that GRC, but realistically, your employees being your first line of defense is a misnomer. It's your GRC that's the first line of defense, right? And I think that's kind of overlooked.
And this term GRC is become it's become a big, first of all, it's only 3 letters. It's easy to paste on things. I happen to be in the GRC space, so I'm seeing a lot of GRC washing of cyber right now, where people are talking about how good they are at compliance. But the reason why that is, it's not just the flavor of the day. It's because there's recognition now that actually, what we're actually talking about is that you have a program, a cyber program, and that there's a set of there's a framework with a set of guidance you're following to arrive at a destination, and that destination is being safe, and your organization has taken all the steps necessary to keep themselves safe, which is not all technical. It's a little bit technical and a little bit people and a little bit of transferring risk to others, right? Like insurers.
Perhaps an element of culture there as well.
Yeah,
Matt,
you have to do everything really to win, to get to that outcome of being safe. And it takes more than just being great at configuring a security tool, right? And so that's really where you need outside expertise, because there's hundreds of tools you could use. And just because you know how to use the tools doesn't mean you know how to use them in a efficient way. And what I mean by that is your overall spend, right? Getting the maximum risk reduction for the amount of resources you're putting in. You really need those experts in industry that have been in many different situations, that are up and they're seeing what different organizations are doing now in 2025 and can help you steer towards those 2025 decisions that the whole industry is moving through. Brad, I want to take a moment before we leave today to just talk about what are the steps that you think, if you think you might be in long form territory, right? What are the steps you should be thinking about, and what's the timeline? Like, let's say you already are insured and you have a renewal coming up. Like, when do we need to start this process of bringing in an expert and starting to build the case?
You need to start a year before the renewal. In other words, just after the first renewal, you need to start again. And that's basically what we do for our clients. So we're going beyond just the initial cyber assess, as we call it, and go, right, here's your starting point. What we then do, and what most of our clients then engage with us on, is a full GRC program with all the technology bits that they need to cover the cybersecurity part. And we run a complete program from the start.
Mm-hmm.
And what it does, and Matt, as you know, from the compliance frameworks, we are able then, using the knowledge within those frameworks, we're able to pose the questions to the IT technologists sitting within the business. Why are they using the technology the way they are? And because of my technology business background, rather coming from the MSP side, where that's all we focused on in our early days, was going, you need patch management. And the guys go, oh, that's great. But my question is now, yeah, you need patch management, definitely. But why are you doing it? And how are you doing it? And what is your policy? And what is your procedure? And is that actually culminating in a result? Otherwise, you're just taking patch, and it's a subject close to our heart. You can just run it and run it and run it and run it and never know whether you're succeeding or not. So getting back to your question around how do you run that program, you need to run it continually. You need to then, because in doing it with our clients, when it comes to renewal time, basically all the broker does is come to us and go, Brad, here's a renewal form. Give us a report. Give us your backing. Give us what the client has been doing for the last year. And then we articulate that. So we do the form. That's great. Whether it's a long form, short form, doesn't matter. But we articulate everything that we've managed for the client over the last year. And we present it to the underwriter in such a way, a 3-page report, which is, it's quick for someone to read, because as Freddy said, their time is precious. But so they're able to take the form, take our quick report, look at the two, and make a really, really good risk decision. And that's what, and it's worked out for our clients. I mean, there's I know some brokers that I work with that are actually on the live stream today, and they've benefited massively. Well, their clients have benefited massively through them engaging with us and being able to present the client as a good risk to the underwriter. What's that meant? Even better premium reductions on top of the soft market, and better cover. And in high risk industries, I mean, we're talking about big retailers, billions of pounds turnover, and they're still getting good cover despite the M&S hits and so on.
And this is the intelligence of your process, the fact that you're objectively outside the company looking in, right?
Yeah.
You're not the IT director filling out this form,
Exactly.
right?
But
And
Matt,
you're
just
really
something important on that, because of my knowledge within the IT business environment and industry for so long, I know the temperaments of an IT manager. What did they up against? Your large organization, they're running around operationally, they're trying to fix all this stuff, and your typical, someone would come in and start, well, you need to answer these questions now. You need to tell me what you've been doing. So what would anyone do in any other area? They would get defensive, they would feel threatened. Would they cooperate? No. So our approach has been, we're in this together, we're going to help you do your job better, and we're going to reduce the friction and the tension that you are enduring or have to endure. And they're going, great, just take this away from us. We want to see the results of what you're doing, obviously, but it's such a, and I don't know who said it, whether it's Freddy or yourself, but it's such a win-win-win situation. The client wins, the underwriter wins, the broker wins. It's a complete solution.
Well, let's talk about in terms of reaching out to InfoProtect, beginning this process. What's the call to action here? People are going to go to your website.
Go to our website. We've got two routes. We've got the broker route, and we've got your organization route, where you can click on the links. There's a whole lot of downloadable information on there. There's case studies. There's blogs with information. There's white papers covering all the high risk industries. And for brokers that want to work with us, we go even further with our broker experience promise. But that all comes from the engagement from our website. It's all on there.
Great. So infoprotect.co.uk. And just real quick before we leave today, Freddy, thank you so much for joining us. I love when we get to bring in experts in industry that have a different experience, industry experience. So Brad, by the way, Brad, before I get into Freddy, I love the fact that you started out in finance, because you arrived in IT, and most people that have run an MSP in the past, it's 80% started in engineering and 20% in sales. So I love that financial operations experience background, and I know it brings something unique to the table. So that was thank you for that story today.
Thank you.
Freddy, I also like bringing in experts that have such a different career experience that I learn something from every conversation. So, Freddy, thank you for joining us today. Night work strategies. you give me the 20-second here. What do you guys do?
So based on the work that I've done over the last 15 years or so in the insurance space, I'm now working with insurance brokers, MGAs, insurers and reinsurers, and insurtech businesses, looking to kind of tap into my understanding, having worked on both sides of the fence, on how best to position their products, how to future-proof their solutions, their wordings, their coverage, their risk management tools, and basically acting as a support network of sorts that has fingers in lots of pies across the entire cyber, tech, professional indemnity, and professional financial solutions market.
Great. And thank you for joining us today. I think that's it for today. Keep an ear out for upcoming episodes of the MSP Cyber Roundtable. And thanks, everyone, for joining.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you very
everyone.
much.